Good morning. My name is Neil Blackman. I work in the Technical Support and Product Development departments at Replacement Parts Industries. Today we're going to be talking about the Stryker 940 cast saw, how to go about replacing the armature assembly. While we're doing that, we're going to talk about some of the tools and parts that are available, problems that might come along the way, and some ideas of how to make your job a little bit easier. Today we're talking about the 940 cast saw made by Stryker. It has an accessory vacuum system, but is a self-contained unit. We're going to be disassembling it. The first thing we want to be sure is that we are electrically safe. As you can see, the power supply is on the table, but it's going to be in my way for the moment. So I'm going to get rid of the wires, just lay them over the side, and that way they're not in my way. First thing we're going to have to do is disassemble the cast saw. We're going to use a 3/16 Allen wrench into the hole and unscrew completely. Then to get the blade out, we need to lift it, push the blade towards the top of the cast cutter till it's disengaged, pull it forward and pull it out. We're going to remove the blade guard. That's done with a straight bladed screwdriver. And you pull up and forward. The blade guard comes off. The next thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to take the brushes out. We'll use a straight bladed screwdriver. One brush, cap, one brush. Second cap, second brush. Now, okay, so in order to get the case opened on the 940 cast saw, there are 3 screws we have to remove. One you'll be able to see here in the vacuum port, and the other 2 are located behind a decal that's mounted around the power switch. We're going to pull that decal off, and then we have exposure to the 3 screws that we're going to need to remove. We're going to use a T15 driver. There's also a T15 wrench available. And we're going to remove 3 screws. And we should be able to take the entire top of the case off. There are 3 screws along with 3 lock washers. And we now have the back of the case open, and we can set that aside. We'll need it later. The next thing I'm going to want to do at this point is work on the head end of the cast saw. In order to do that, again, we'll need a T15 driver, and we're going to remove 4 screws. These screws have flat washers and lock washers. Put that down. And we now can remove the head assembly, or the output drive assembly. There's an O-ring around the outside to seal it. One of the major problems that people have with this assembly involves this threaded screw that holds the blade guard in place. Should you run into a problem where dust gets in there and you can't have trouble screwing the blade guards in or out, yes, you can clean these threads, but replacing the entire head assembly is not a bad idea because these threads will eventually wear out, and you'll have a lot of problems with breaking that threaded bolt. And the next thing we need to remove is the roller bearing that actually moves the output drive. To do this job, I like to use a dental pick, and there is a very small C-clip beryllium copper washer, which is that copper looking thing. And we are going to use a dental pick to remove it. So after a little bit of a struggle, we've removed the beryllium copper E-clip. We're going to set it down. Then we're going to take off a flat washer, and we're going to remove the roller bearing. Okay. Now this roller bearing actually consists of two parts. There is an inner race and an outer race, and one more washer. We have now removed the roller bearing, both of the flat washers, and the beryllium E-clip, and now we're ready to go back to disassembling the cast cutter itself. The next thing we're going to want to do is remove the rear part of the cast saw. Turn the cast saw over, and we're going to get our T15 driver, and we're going to remove 4 more screws, along with block washers and flat washers. The next thing we're going to want to do is remove this rear framing. Now it can be a little bit tight. I like to go in with a flat-bedded screwdriver and just give it a little tug. Out it comes, along with a large magnet assembly. The 940 cast saw does have an armature, but it does not use field windings. It uses a permanent magnet for field windings, and it comes as one assembly, no disassembly needed. So we're just going to set that aside. And now we have access to the rear bearing and to the actual armature, which is this part in here. The next thing we want to do is actually get the armature out. In order to do that, we need a specialized tool. Here it is. It's called a cam removal tool. It's double-sided, works for both the 800 series and the 900 series cast saws. We're going to use the smaller size. I'm going to turn the cast saw over. We're going to lock it onto the end of the cam. I'm going to just grab the armature with my hand, and we're going to use a tool to spin off the cam. There it is. We'll put this down for a second. Show you there's the tool. There's the cam. Now we're finally ready to remove the armature from the cast saw itself. Now I have found the easiest way to go about doing that. Take a rag, kind of wrap it around the body of the cast saw, and we're just going to lay it down to get some support in a small table vise that I have set up here. Okay, so we've got it locked into the table vise. We're going to use a pin punch. Hammer, a couple of taps. And this is some of the things that you're going to be looking for on this assembly. As you can see, We've got a lot of wear going on in the commutator. This is where the brushes run. And sometimes these grooves in this commutator will become clogged, and that's part of the reason why you would want to replace this. Now, this particular armature also has a broken wire. I'm not sure that this will show up very well, but there it is. That can be repaired if you are skillful enough, but the easiest thing to do is to swap it out. So now we've removed the armature from the cast saw. It came out with the rear bearing attached, which is fine. In this case, we're going to go ahead and replace that. If I didn't want to replace it, I could take the rear bearing off the armature and reuse it with our new armature. But we're going to get the bad armature out of the way. Now, while we have this part disassembled, the other part that you might want to consider removing is the front bearing, which is this here. For today's demonstration, we're not going to bother pulling the forward bearing out. It's pretty simple to do with a pair of pliers to get the C-clips out. They're just held in place by a groove and the bearing falls right out. We do sell the forward bearing. It's about that size, and it comes out pretty quickly. And here I have our new armature. The first thing that I'm going to do is, with the new armature, you will find two small washers. These washers are spacers, and they are applied on the rear of the armature's central shaft. There are two styles, one that is flat and one that has a wave to it. We're going to install the first flat washer, followed by the wave washer. New armature, small washers in place. The next thing we need to do is install the bearing. Now I'm going to grease this bearing just to make it a little bit easier to get on the shaft. Sometimes this rear bearing can be a bit of a struggle, so I'm going to put some grease on the end of the shaft to make it a little bit easier. Then I'm going to take my bearing and do the same thing. I'm going to grease the internal channel of the bearing to also make it hopefully go on a little bit easier. And we're going to line it up and hopefully send it on through. Now, if it gives you a hard time, there it goes. Don't worry if it doesn't completely seat. We will get that rest of that seating taken care of in just a minute. Now we're going to go ahead and put it back in the cast saw and continue the reassembly process. We're going to drop the new armature in so that the shaft is starting to come through the end of the front bearing. And the armature is in place. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the permanent magnet. Now this is directional, and if you remember from when we disassembled the cast saw, there were 3 screws. 2 screws that were near where the power switch was, and 1 screw in the vacuum assembly. So when we put this in, we're going to slide it in place, you can get a little pulley there, over the armature so that the single screw is on top and the 2 screws are on the bottom. So now we've got that in place, and we're going to take our friendly little tapper here, and use a little bit of a rag to keep things safe, and we're just going to tap that down, seating the rear bearing in the housing and the armature shaft in the front bearing. Okay. And just a little push there shoves that the final way in place. We have 4 screws with lock washers and flat washers that go in next. And using our T15, go ahead and send these screws home. Okay, and I like to give it a little bit of a turn with my hand here and make sure that the bearings are running smooth, everything looks good. Once we've got the armature into the housing, the next part is replacing the cam. Cam screws onto the front of the armature. And we're going to ensure that the armature doesn't turn by just holding it in place with our fingers. And we're going to put a little turn on there and make sure that that's snugged. And that's good and snug. Next step, we're going to go ahead and reuse our needle bearing. Now, if you were to purchase a needle bearing, it comes in a kit with a new washer, new flat washers, and a new beryllium washer. We're just going to reuse what we've got. 1 flat washer, 1 needle bearing race, 1 outer bearing race, another flat washer, and our removed beryllium washer from before, which actually usually goes in better than it comes out. And we're just going to use my fingers here and press it into the groove on the shaft. And there it is. It goes in better than it comes out. Okay, and while we're at this stage, we're just going to stick a little grease up on top here to make sure that everything kind of stays all together. And this bearing has a little bit of grease on its outside surface. Now, the next step is we need to replace the drive assembly. And this can get a little bit tricky. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to first of all take the O-ring and get it into the correct position on the drive assembly, and that is fully laying on the bottom, not in the housing, but just sitting in place, kind of like that. Okay, and what's going to happen is we're going to install this assembly onto the top of the cast saw. Now there is, as part of this assembly, a metal harp, a part with 2 bars on it, and the needle bearing has to fit in the middle. So what I will try to do is kind of line it up and give it a little twist to make sure that it sort of starts the seating process. Now the next bit is a little bit tricky because this will not actually seat until the O-ring is out of the way. And in order to do that, I'm going to use my dental pick, here it is, and go around and just push that O-ring in so that it's inside of the cast saw and not hanging up under the drive assembly. We're going to go all the way around and just work that into the groove and press down on the drive assembly as we go around. And when we've gotten it all in place, the drive assembly just slips in. Then we reinstall 4 screws with 4 lock washers and 4 flat washers. Okay, got the front end of the cast saw reassembled. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to get our rear housing back from where it's been stored, here on the floor. It is directional. The vacuum housing goes on the top, and it just slips into place. I'm going to turn this up, and now we're going to replace the 3 screws that only have lock washers and no flat washers. And then we're going to go ahead and reuse our decal by the switches. It is also sold separately. In this case, we're going to be able to reuse it. And we're just going to press that in with the back of our dental tool. And we now have the case closed. Okay, so the next step, now that we've got the rear case closed, is we need to put the brushes back. Now these are used brushes. We do sell new ones, but since they are used, they have a little bit of a curve on the front, and I'm going to make sure when I install them that that curve is in the correct direction so that it runs properly on the commutator. We're going to install one brush and one brush cap. We're going to use our screwdriver and just tighten that brush cap down. Turn it over and do the exact same thing on the other side, ensuring that the brush is oriented. Since it is a used brush, ensure it's oriented correctly. If we were new, they would just be flat at the end. You wouldn't have to care about that. Okay, now we've got our brushes back in. Next thing we're going to do is reassemble our blade guard. Turn it this way. Blade guard goes in on the front and hooks under the blade mounting assembly. In order to put it in place, we need a screwdriver. Tighten that down nice and snug. And then we're going to put our blade in place. Using the 3/16 Allen wrench, we'll tighten that up. Okay. We're going to go ahead, plug the power supply into a wall outlet. Low speed, high speed. We verified that the cast cutter is working, and we have now replaced the armature on the Stryker 940 cast saw. We'll need to take the blade out. So we're going to use a 9/16 Allen wrench. No, that's wrong. We're going to use a 3/16 Allen wrench. Make sure we correct that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the blade guard. That's done with a straight bladed screwdriver. That's done with a straight bladed screwdriver. If we can get a little bit closer, is a beryllium copper washer, which is that copper looking thing. Now I have found the easiest way to go about doing that is to take a rag and whoops, that happens.